The police officer who killed George Floyd has been sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison. Derek Chauvin learned his fate on Friday. It is the longest sentence a police officer has ever received in the state of Minnesota.
Chauvin was convicted of second-degree murder of Floyd, whose death sparked protests against police violence and racism across the country. Max Alvarez, editor-in-chief of The Real News, and Rachel Bovard, senior director of policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, join us now to discuss the sentencing. Rachel, what did you think?
Well, I think it was, fairly in line with what most experts suggested. I think the second degree murder charge baseline was at about 12 and a half years with about 10 years, give or take, the judge could play with there. And he did. And I think, as you point out, it's the highest or longest sentence a police officer has received in the state of Minnesota. I think it's also fairly large for the national average. Police officers, I think the average sentence is 15 years in cases like this. So he is receiving a higher sentence. But, I think the jury decided and the judge, I think, was in line with what the jury recommended. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the system working. Whether or not there's going to be additional reforms from Congress after this, I think is sort of the next outstanding question.
I want to pick up on what Rachel just said with you, Max, the system working. A, do you agree that this is a good example of the system working? And then B, do you think some of the groups and the people who formed the movements that initially protested the killing will share that belief as well, that the system worked and justice was rendered fairly?
It's a really interesting question because my initial response is to say yes, but probably not in the way that Rachel means it. I mean, because I'm also everything that Rachel said, co-sign that. I mean, I do think that there are a lot of people, right, who are breathing a sigh of relief and feeling like that the system is not entirely broken, right, that justice in some form was served, that the man who we all watched crush George Floyd into unbeing with his knee got, the sentencing that, he deserved. And, I don't want to discount that, right? I think that, a lot of people were really hoping to keep some sort of faith in our law enforcement system and that the Derek Chauvin trial would kind of bear that out. And so I don't want to, again, discount like what that means and the importance and significance of this sort of sentencing. But when I think about the system working as it should, I'm also trying to kind of contextualize this verdict and this sentencing, in the larger sort of like media and political sort of swirl that we're in, where, after a year after this happened, what we are now seeing is the kind of political, police, and media establishment kind of kicking into gear in order to segment Derek Chauvin off as like the one bad actor, while simultaneously increasing a kind of propaganda narrative about bedlam in our cities and rising crime, thus justifying even greater budgetary boosts for policing. Biden just said that cities can use COVID money to increase policing. I think that cities around the country, even those budgets in general kind of shrank, the percentage of police expenditures as a percentage of city budgets actually rose. So in fact, you're seeing the kind of like very things that the movement called to address. These are actually, the things that are going the opposite direction.
Yeah, and Rachel, I want to ask you about the system working. Do you feel like if there had not been a global movement around George Floyd's murder, that you would have had this result? Because to me, the system working is when nobody's paying attention, the system delivers a result like this. And you can't require a heroic effort on the part of social movements in order to force a 22-and-a-half-year sentence. You have to get to a place where somebody commits a crime like this, the system then punishes them. So do you feel like this would have happened without people taking to the street?
I think it's an entirely fair question. And I think that's the issue that's being raised at the level of policymakers now is, to your point, would this have even happened? Or are there structural things that need to change to make sure, we can address this stuff going forward? And, I think it's interesting to look at the case itself, because on the matters of law, there wasn't really a lot of quibbling. I mean, you saw the judge be fairly severe with Derek Chauvin on the questions of law, with what the jury had said, acting that out in a sentence, and denying Derek Chauvin, too, his request for a new trial. His defense attorneys had requested that. The judge affirmatively said, no, you're not getting that. His defense attorneys had requested probation, and instead he got a 22-and-a-half-year sentence on top of that. So on questions of law, I do think that there was some progress there. But that's the question for policymakers now is, to your point, if this had happened, and it didn't receive all the protests, is qualified immunity, sort of that protection that police officers get, from trials, usually from, responsibility in these cases, does that need to be modified so cases like this can go forward at a faster level? And that seems to be the breaking point right now in the Senate in particular, is over whether or not qualified immunity should be just for police departments or for police officers specifically themselves. That seems to be the issue that they're trying to address, which I think goes exactly to the point you're raising.
And there's one way to think about this, which is that there's two systems in question here. The first is the policing system, and the second is the legal system and the judicial system. So the question then would be, where the judicial system did its job, we're never going to perfect the police in this country. There will always be, there will always be instances of egregious use of force. Then does the judicial system step in and work? Ryan's question is a really interesting one, as you were talking about, Rachel, because the same logic that we apply to juries about sort of bringing biases into this case played out just about everybody who handled it when there was this global uprising. Now, here's a bit of sound from the Floyd family's attorney, Benjamin Crump, who had this to say.
Today represents an opportunity to be a turning point in America. This is the longest sentence that a police officer has ever been sentenced to in the history of the state of Minnesota. But this should not be the exception when a black person is killed by brutality by police. It should be the norm. And so when we think about real justice would be, Silky, that George Floyd would still be here with his family. So what we got today was some measure of accountability.
So that gets exactly to the distinction between the two systems. You have accountability in the judicial system, and then perhaps still issues in the policing system. So Max, how do you see what Crump is talking about there? Do you think he's getting at the fact that this is downstream, the judicial victory, if you can call it that, is downstream of another question about another system?
I would say yes and no. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree that we should understand this sentencing and this verdict more in terms of accountability than justice. As the speaker rightly said, justice would be George Floyd still alive with his family. Let alone justice would also mean just the millions of people who are imprisoned for lesser offenses, people who have been crushed by law enforcement for no good reason, having their lives back, right? We have a long way to go until we reach something called justice. But I think that your point, Emily, is really fascinating because you do have these two systems, and I think it's the way that they interact with each other and thereby shape each other that we should be looking at, right? I mentioned earlier, right, how this is all kind of depressing because a lot of the same people and even some of the same news outlets that we saw, that we saw kind of actually responding to the global movement that emerged this time last year by asking questions that I have seldom seen the media or the political establishment ask in my entire lifetime. Like do police actually reduce crime? Do increased police budgets equal, less crime, so on and so forth. But then, again, within the span of months, in less than a year, right, we have seen how easily, right, consent can be manufactured by playing a number of select clips about someone robbing a Walgreens, right? And then suddenly that whole mood just switches back over. People drop their commitment to justice like that when they feel like, and they're being told that, their property or their safety is at risk. And a lot of that narrative is coming straight out of police departments who have a very vested interest in making us afraid, right? Because their jobs in a lot of ways and their police budgets depend on it, right? And actually, to make the point a little clearer, the reason why I say law enforcement and the legal system actually shape each other in really interesting ways. It's like, think about when you're trying to kind of like bodybuild, right? We only use law enforcement only actually focuses on certain elements of the law. It only enforces certain elements of the law, and thereby it like builds up like a massive right arm muscle while its internal organs and its core are actually decaying. To make that concrete, think about something like wage theft, which is probably like one of the biggest unacknowledged crimes in this country. A 2017 study by the Economic Policy Institute suggested that it accounts for over half of theft in this country. And yet, it is not the thing that we see on the news. It is not the hysteria that the media is portraying. It is not the thing that law enforcement actually goes after. The law enforcement selectively chooses which laws to kind of enforce and who selectively chooses whom to enforce them upon. And that's how you end up with this real Frankenstein's monster of a system that we have today.
Right, and Max, let's have one other uncomfortable conversation around sentences. When this sentence was released, because of the country that we live in, so many people were able to say 22 and a half years is much less than, and just fill in the blank, this nonviolent drug trafficker. Chelsea Manning was given 35 years in maximum security for releasing evidence of war crimes. But historically, that's way out of whack. But even when Joseph Stalin started giving people 25-year sentences in the 1920s, 1930s, the world was appalled. Say 25 years? That you don't put anybody in prison for 25 years. Now we're at a place where if somebody doesn't get up to 25, we're like, wait a minute, this was too weak. And so you have this ratchet effect where the sentences that we hear about in the public are from the most heinous crimes, and people want those to be higher. And the sentences that we don't hear about are the 10s, 20s, and 30s for these everyday people who are then making up 2+ million of our prison population. How do you ever ratchet that back?
You ratchet it back, I think, by doing what, the movement that arose last summer. And I say arose, the movement has existed for a long time, but it really reached new heights after George Floyd's murder, Breonna Taylor's murder this time last year. What the movement has been calling for, right? And what bad faith actors who have taken the mantra or the slogan of defund the police and have really twisted it to mean something that it never really meant. The whole point of it was to say that you can't talk about the injustices of our policing system without looking at how they fit into the broader injustices of the way American society is arranged, who it's arranged to protect, and who actually poses the real threat to the status quo, right? The policing system, as you mentioned, Ryan, has become this massive halfway house for a broken society that has no other ways to address poverty and inequality and systemic racism, right? It's just our society has such a kind of brutal downward slope that feeds people into this meat grinder, either to be killed by police, imprisoned, or, because poverty itself has been criminalized, right? And so you can't understand or come to an answer on that question about sentencing and the disparities therein without thinking about how the policing system has evolved to become a sort of patch, a sort of horrifying pain management system for a society that refuses to address its deeper systemic issues.
So quickly before we run, Rachel, do you think there's any appetite for bipartisan sentencing reform in the future?
Well, let's not forget this issue, and a small subset of this issue was one area where Republicans and Democrats agreed with Donald Trump during his term and passed the First Step Act, which doesn't go nearly far enough to address, I think, all the things that Max laid out, but was the first well, to use the term, first step, I think, in addressing a much larger, issue at bay. And that's not insignificant, right? I think an actual congressional action on this front hasn't been taken in, decades. And so you'd hope that they would find common ground on this issue to, as Max pointed out, which is, deep and wide. And I think touches so many areas of America's life. And so I think, action on this front happened. Let's hope it continues.
Well, Rachel, Max, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Coming up, journalist Zed Jelani weighs in on General Milley's defense of critical race theory when Rising returns.